Hello, everybody. This is Arindam Bag here again. So, today we are going to start the presentation on Pride and Prejudice. We are starting the um, story of Pride and Prejudice, and as you can see in the opening slide, I'll be dealing with the volume 1, chapter 1 to 6. And in this presentation, you will have summary, analysis, important quotes. So, I will try to describe the story of the novel briefly through this presentation. So, without any wait, let us start. So, in chapter 1, the important lines are like this. The first line is itself very interesting. It shows the attitude of the author. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Now, this is a very famous line actually, and in university exams and in any other exams, um, this particular line, from this particular line, questions are asked like, what is the significance of the opening line? So basically, this is a humorous and a line full of irony. So this is at the beginning. With this line, the novel starts. Now, the next line we have Mr. Bennet, how can you abuse your own children in such a way? You take delight in vexing me. You have no compassion on my poor nerves. These words are said by Mrs. Bennet. It is been addressed toward his husband, Mr. Bennet. Um, uh, she is very concerned about her daughters, Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet. As you have seen in the character mapping, they have five uh, daughters. So Mrs. Bennet said this to Mr. Bennet, and in response of that, Mr. Bennet said, "You mistake me, my dear. I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have heard you mention them with consideration these 20 years at least." So Mr. Bennet replied with a bit of humor to his wife that he respects his wife's nerves and they are his old companion for the last 20 years. And there is a comment in this section also in the chapter 1. She, Mrs. Bennet, was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Its solace was visiting and news. The narrator. This is this actually sums up the very basic idea of the novel. If you are looking for this answer, that what is the main theme of this novel? What is all about? This is a romantic novel, obviously, but Mrs. Bennet is that character who is really concerned about her daughter's marriage. See, her only intention, her only objective of her life is, um, ma- getting arrangement for the marriage of her daughters. So, actually, quite justified also from her point that she often explained that she have five daughters, so she is really concerned about their future. So let us move to the summary of chapter 1. So I have mentioned the important lines. Please go through that. If you have any, if you have the original text with you, find these lines and find the context of that. I tried to explain that context. So what you got here in chapter 1, volume 1? The narrator begins the story. One day in their modest house in Longbourn, Mrs. Bennet shares some news with her husband, Mr. Bennet. So remember the place of these places. Longbourn. It is a place where the Bennet family lives Longbourn. Later on in the novel, you will find that the names of several places will be mentioned, and according to that names, characters are associated. Like Longbourn is associated with the Bennet family. So Mrs. Bennet got some sort of news. A wealthy young gentleman, Charles Bingley, has just rented the nearby estate of Netherfield. Now, this is another place. It is close to Longbourn, and that particular place can be rented. People visiting from the city, they often stay there. They rent the particular property or estate. They stay there, and according to the information, one young gentleman named Charles Bingley just rented the nearby estate of Netherfield. So that's why Mrs. Bennet is excited. Now, you might be wondering why excited. I told you earlier that her only concern is she is looking suitable husband for her daughters, and whenever she find any bachelor man with a good fortune, as per the first line said in the in the opening line of the novel, good fortune is a potential husband. He looks for that. She looks for that. Mrs. Bennet is excited because she wants him to meet her daughters and hopefully marry one. So this is her plan actually. She was excited. Mrs. Bennet asked her husband to get them an introduction. Mr. Bennet purposefully frustrated his wife by sarcastically replying that he will write to give his consent for Bingley to marry any of his daughters, especially Elizabeth, whom he considers especially bright. Now, Elizabeth has a special bonding with her papa. Even in the movie, you say that Elizabeth is addressing to her father as papa. You know, so um, he considers that if Bingley wished to marry Elizabeth, he will give consent. Now, on that context, in this context, Mrs. Bennet said that line, you do not respect my poor nerves and that, and Mr. Bennet replied that I have highest respect for you now. So the first chapter of any book is vital. This is the analysis section of chapter 1. The very first line speaks about the main theme. Yep. I told you earlier that the very first line is very important. Please prepare some notes. I will supply you some notes. Don't bother about it. The very first line speaks about the main theme, establishes a humorous atmosphere, and introduces the theme of marriage. Present Elizabeth as the heroine. So, what are the things we have? First line describes the theme. Second one establishes a humorous atmosphere and introduces the theme of marriage. Present Elizabeth as the heroine. It has been clear to us. Important lines of chapter 2. Now, she, bracket you have Mrs. Long, is a selfish, hypocritical woman, and I have no opinion of her. Mrs. Bennet. Who says this? Mrs. Bennet. Mrs. Bennet describing somebody else as hypocritical. Okay, that will be interesting. Now, chapter 2 summary. Without telling his family, Mr. Bennet visits Bingley. Actually, both of them are concerned. Mr. Bennet is also concerned about his daughters. So does Mrs. Bennet. But there is a difference between Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet. Mrs. Bennet is very, elaborative, expressive. She always express her concern, and she is sometimes she is very much straightforward. Uh, but on the other hand, Mr. Bennet is not that kind of person. He's a fine gentleman with a fine sense of humor. She is not, sorry, Mr. Bennet is not that type of expressiveness you will not find in the character of Mr. Bennet. But he is really concerned and he is very serious. But he would like to keep things, uh, you know, he wants to do things in a discreet way. So, without telling his family, Mr. Bennet visits Bingley. Back at home, Mr. Bennet teases his family by pretending to be uninterested in Bingley's arrival. The way he appears, that he is not interested. Whoever is Bingley is, he may come. Why I should bother? Things like that. But later reveals his visit by asking Elizabeth when the next ball is scheduled and promising to introduce her to Bingley beforehand. So later on he mentioned, informed Elizabeth that a ball is scheduled. Now this ball, this is not just an ordinary ball. Ball means a party, mostly dance party, where people get to know each other. This is a social gathering. Right now we are we are maintaining social distancing. We are not doing anything like that. But back in those days, this is a very common thing there. This is a social gathering. People get to know each other. Young men and women, they dance with each other, and chances are there they would like each other and get married. So it was a fine um, opportunity actually. This analysis is it was inappropriate for women to seek a direct introduction to men. Yeah, it was not very sober if any woman directly introduced herself to a man. That was not the custom back then, you know. So Mr. Bennet must initially act as the mediator. Mr. Bennet visit shows that even he recognizes the importance of making a match. See, the concern about Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet, their approach is completely different. An early sign of Mrs. Bennet's fickle character, she can snap from disapproval to approval. Yep, Mrs. Bennet, I told you earlier that you cannot predict Mrs. Bennet. She is like changing all the time. Her intentions, her attitude, her words, they are very much, fickle. She is very much a fickle character. But Mr. Bennet is a very serious character. So let's next we have chapter 3, important lines which you need to know or at least go through. To be fond of dancing was a certain step towards falling in love. The narrator, yes, this I told you earlier, these types of balls were very important back in those days, because if they dance together, if the man and woman they dance together, they get to know each other. The chances are they can um, they can be they can develop a relationship. Like nowadays it is known as dating. People, man and woman, they meet somewhere in a nice place. They spend some time with each other because they are looking for a partner, looking for a friend, might be looking for um, a stable relationship. Right now it is known as dating, but that was not acceptable at that time. So ball or the dancing was the accepted uh, format where young men and women can meet each other, and if they find each other's character interesting, they can start a relationship or an affair. Mr. Darcy soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person, handsome features, noble man. Oops, there's a mistake over there. Please ignore that. That should be noble man. Uh, there's a spelling mistake actually. And the report, which was in general circulation within 5 minutes after his entrance, of his having 10,000 a year. See, please remember the opening line of this novel, where it is been said, with a good fortune. Now, this one having 10,000 a year, 10,000 pound a year. So that means to understand the character and to understand the future of a character, people first they were interested about the earning of the man. Now, in this case, Mr. Darcy, who happens to be the friend of Charles Bingley, Mr. Darcy is the hero of this novel. And obviously, a hero should be presented in such a manner so that everybody might get attracted. So in this case also, he is tall person, handsome features, he's a nobleman, and there is a report about his character that he earns 10,000 pound a year, which is lot at that time. At that time, it was a huge amount. He is considered to be a rich person, not middle class people. And this person, Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Bennett, the family of Mr. Bennett, the Bennett family is entirely they belong to the middle class family. But this is something which we may say jackpot, because 10,000 a year means a lot. Even in today's system, uh, any arranged marriage, people are interested to understand the earning capability of men. Okay, right now it is also very important for people to know, to understand how much this person earns. And from my personal experience, I have seen that the more you earn, it appears, the more you earn, the bitter truth of the society is the more you earn, the more respectable you are in this context. It hardly matters how much educated you are, what kind of person you are, from which family you belong, it doesn't matter anymore. So, in this context here, 10,000 a year means a lot. So, important lines we have still some have here. His character was decided he was the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world, and everybody hoped that he would never come there again, the narrator. So, everybody inside that ball, they understood one thing very clearly: being rich, it is the prejudice of Elizabeth also. She considers that rich people they must be very bad. She never accepts this kind of richness or things like that. And he is considered to be the proudest, most disagreeable person. And next, the line is said by Mr. Darcy. It is about Elizabeth. She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. It is said by Mr. Darcy. Uh, when asked by Charles Bingley that do you find anyone interesting in this ball, he was asking about Charles Bingley was asking about Elizabeth, whether you find Elizabeth uh, acceptable, whether you like her. At that time, Mr. Darcy said, she is tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt me. This word, when he said this, Elizabeth was close by. She heard it, and her woman ego was badly hurt. Perfectly tolerable, but not sorry. She is tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt me. Okay. Now this word handsome means beautiful enough. So summary of chapter 3 is Mr. Bingley pays a return visit to Mr. Bennet, and he invited to dinner at Longbourn, and he was invited uh, to Longbourn. Elaborate plans are made, but Bingley breaks them because of urgent business in London. Suddenly there was a change of plan. There was a plan that Bingley will come to Longbourn and will have dinner with the Bennet family, but suddenly he left. He soon returns, however, along with his sister, Mrs. Hurst, and her husband, his youngest sister Caroline, and his friend Darcy for the upcoming ball. So this is how things goes on. So there was an introduction of the character Mr. Bingley, and then there was a plan that Bingley will attend a dinner at Longbourn, but suddenly he changed the plan and he returns to Netherfield Park, and he comes back with his sister Mrs. Hurst and her husband, and Caroline, and he brought his close friend Darcy for the upcoming ball. There's a call. Okay, please stay on the line. Wait, please. Yep. So the ball takes place at Meriton, where the locals gossip about the newcomers. Darcy is handsome but proud and aloof. Yes, Darcy is the richest character over here. So he's bit very proud and he seems to be aloof. Bingley makes friend with everyone. Yeah, Bingley is a very jolly character. Even if you see the movie version of this novel, you will see that Bingley is very jolly, dancing every dance, including several with Jane, which makes the Bennets very happy. So he was kind of impressed. So that's why he participated with Jane Bennet, several time in dancing. Elizabeth overhears Bingley tell Darcy that Jane is the most beautiful girl he's ever seen. Yep. Clearly, Bingley is in love with Jane. Bingley demands that Darcy find someone to dance with and suggests Elizabeth. At that time, I told you, remember, that not handsome enough to tempt me. Darcy says isn't pretty enough for him. Elizabeth overhears and is annoyed. So let us analyze the chapter 3. Austen focuses on just a few families of different status, the extremely wealthy upper class, Bingley and Darcy, and the less wealthy country gentry, the Bennets, in order to reveal the class dynamics of a society on a small scale. Yep. She perfectly presented these two types of people who belongs to the rich circle and who belongs to the middle class. And Bingley and Darcy belongs to the wealthy upper class, and they belongs to the Bennets belong to the middle class. Balls were among the few socially acceptable venues for mingling between the sexes. I told you about this ball earlier. Here, the locals make character judgment based on appearances and first impressions. Yes, remember this one. First impression is going to last for a long time. So here also, when people first watched or observed the character, when they were introduced to the character like Darcy, they already have their judgment. So initially, Darcy doesn't think these country people are good enough for him. Elizabeth has pride too, though looks aren't everything to her. Darcy insults still sting. So I told you that women